Northern Ireland was another pressing issue for President Biden during his talks with Boris Johnson.
Yeah, joining us now to talk about that and other issues from the summit is Washington Post chief political correspondent Dan Balz. Dan, thanks for joining us. I don't believe that these two leaders have met before, at least not in this capacity. Can you tell us what the tone was?
Well, the tone seemed quite good in public, as you would expect. I mean, it's important for every British prime minister to have a good relationship with the U.S. president and vice versa. There's been a quote-unquote special relationship between the two countries for decades, and I think that both of these leaders went into these meetings with the idea that they were going to reinforce that and whatever differences they have, and there are some differences over Northern Ireland, as you indicated, those were not going to become part of the public discussion. Everything we saw, both in the optics and in the words, suggested great cooperation and significant preparation for this meeting.
Do we know, Dan, why they didn't have the traditional joint news conference as they usually do?
Well, I think that one of the reasons is that there would have been a lot of questions, both from the British side and from my American colleagues, about the differences over Northern Ireland. This is a very difficult issue related to Brexit. It's a complicated issue, but President Biden has been very outspoken that nothing in the implementation of the Brexit agreement should threaten the Good Friday Accords from 1998, which have brought relative peace to Northern Ireland after so many decades of violence and troubles and killings. And this issue has flared again just before the president's arrival in England between the EU and the UK. And I think that one of the reasons that they didn't do a joint press conference was there would be much more focus on that than some of the other, I would say, more predictable agreements that they outlined.
Britain, France, Germany, all part of the G7 summit that begins in earnest tomorrow. What do you feel will be the immediate issues, maybe beyond the pandemic, that will take the forefront?
Well, I think the pandemic is very important, and as the president outlined today, this effort to try to help vaccinate the rest of the world is a very, very high priority, and that they're going to stress that. The issue of climate is important. Cybersecurity is important. A variety of those kinds of issues will be on the table. But part of what President Biden is attempting to do is simply to reinforce what he has said heading into this meeting, and really since he got elected, which is that he believes in transatlantic alliances, and that this is a contrast to former President Donald Trump, who often held these groups at abeyance and sometimes heckled them and hectored them. And so part of the president's mission is to say, as he said, America is back as a loyal and robust ally, and he's trying to bring them along to rally the world, or to rally the democracies in the competition both with Russia and with China.
Let's talk about what might be one of the biggest issues to come out of today's meeting. The black blazer that First Lady Jill Biden was wearing with love on the back. Is that a dig to the 2018 jacket that Melania Trump wore? I think, I don't care about, I really don't care, do you?
I think most people will interpret that as such. I suspect that Dr. Biden will say, no, it's just an expression of how we feel about what we're trying to do. But I think that everybody who saw that photograph of that jacket will draw that conclusion that you suggested.
And that jacket has been sold out, by the way. Can't get it anywhere.
How much emphasis is being put on the threats that exist from China and North Korea, and how deeply do you think they will get into that threat?
China, very much so. It's unclear how much they will get into North Korea. I mean, the United States, under President Biden, is trying to take a much tougher line against China, as did former President Trump, but he's trying to do it in a way that he brings the allies along. President Trump's approach was to be unilateral in that relationship with China, and the current president wants to do it a different way. But he sees that as very, very important. I mean, he talked during his State of the Union message, or his joint session speech to Congress, about the competition between democracies and authoritarian governments, and first and foremost among that group would be China. And not every European country has the same relationship with China as the United States does. So this is, in some ways, a challenging issue for him. I mean, I think on the surface, everybody feels the same way, that China is a rising power and in some ways will have to be checked by the West. But there are economic relationships that a number of these countries have with China that are very important to them. So it's easier said than done in trying to bring people to a common understanding and a common strategy.
Chief Political Correspondent Dan Balz at The Washington Post. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.